The second lesson is also taken from the Gospel of Matthew, the 8th chapter. When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, appealing to him, saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed in terrible distress." And Jesus said to him, "I will come and cure him." The centurion answered, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only speak the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man under authority with soldiers unto me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and said to those who followed him, "Truly I tell you, in no one in all of Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west, and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And to the centurion Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you according to your faith." The servant was healed in that hour. One minister struggling to get into this subject one Sunday said, "This morning I'm going to speak on the relationship between fact and faith. It's a fact that you are sitting here in this sanctuary. It's a fact that I'm standing up here speaking, but it is faith that makes me believe you might be listening to what I have to say." Faith, of course, is one of those important words, isn't it? One of the big words. And it is a fact that human life would be quite impossible without a measure of faith. If friends invite you to dinner, you don't ask for some written guarantee as to whether you will survive the food or not. If someone invites you to ride with them in their car, they don't ask you to sign a waiver against a possible suit in case of accident, although we may be approaching that condition in our society. In short, friendship implies faith on both sides, trust in the fidelity of the other. Life together is impossible without some such faith. Society cannot function without a measure of faith in the distant leadership. Education is possible only where the learner trusts the teacher, or for that matter, the teacher has faith in the learner. Even a scientist cannot function without at least the faith that the mathematical formulas in his head bear some correspondence to the real world. In short, faith is an everyday dimension of ordinary existence. But when we move to biblical faith, we're dealing with something far deeper and more critical, with the question of what the old stories call saving faith. Faith that is the difference between anxiety and confidence, between hope and despair, between life and death. And in these old stories, it's clear that some realize this kind of faith in life and others never find it. Truly, I tell you, in no one in the whole of Israel have I found such faith. So I'd like to have us think about this faith this morning and how a person discovers it and how we all can sustain it, the faith that truly saves us. One could pick any number of stories out of the Gospels, but the one I just read you is a typical account of the movement of one man into the life of faith. When Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, begging him, saying, "Lord, my servant is lying at home paralyzed, in terrible shape." The words "my servant" can as easily be translated "my boy," and it may well be here that the man is pleading for his own son. In any event, the story begins with a move of some considerable desperation, does it not? Which is to say, real faith is not available to the dilettante, to the curious, to the half-interested. That's the point of the old story about the fellow in India who went to the local guru and said to him, "I would like to know God." So the guru led him down to the Ganges and out into that holy river, and when they were about waist deep, the guru grabbed him by the neck in an iron grip and shoved him under the water and held him there until bubbles began to rise to the surface. And then he let him go, and the poor fellow, sputtering and gasping, said, "What on earth did you do that for?" And the guru replied, "When you want to know God as badly as you wanted to breathe a few moments ago, then come back and we'll talk." That is, real faith comes only when we're up against what I would call one of the limit experiences of life. Those experiences, those moments when we suddenly realize that we cannot manage on our own. We have run out of our own resources. When we are aware of the reality that we are limited and creaturely, and that not all the ingenuity or money or skill or ambition in the world will really cut it. The man's a centurion, commander of 100 soldiers in the Roman legion, a man with all the culture and power of that great civilization at his beck and call, but he's at his wit's end. His servant or son is desperately ill, and he knows there's not a darn thing he can do about it. And so he begins to make the move toward faith. William Willimon, chaplain at Duke University, tells about a lifelong friend who spun out of control, crossed the median, headed the wrong way down the interstate. In other words, says Willimon, he fell from his prestigious perch as an attorney into the depths of alcoholism. The good news is he's on his way back, thanks to a loving wife and children and the good work of Alcoholics Anonymous. But Willimon goes on to write, among the many things that surprised him on his way back to life was church. He'd always gone to church, but like many intelligent people, he always considered himself a step or so above it all. Church was for intellectual wimps. You would be amazed at what I've learned about God, said my friend to me. Like what, I ask? So many words. I'd heard these words all my life in church, but now suddenly, like a flash of blinding light, they've become real. Words, little Christian slogans that I've heard all my life are suddenly deep and true. Like, you can only find your life by losing it. Like, take up your cross daily and follow me. Then he concludes, my friend does, through my pain, my hitting bottom, I've discovered God. You see, the possibility of faith comes only when we are aware of who we are. People who are limited, creaturely, only when we recognize that we cannot manage everything on our own. But that's scary and not a little humbling, and it's hard to accept and acknowledge, and we do not easily go for help, do we? We prefer to believe in our autonomy, our independence, our capacity to manage all things. One young woman comments that she's gone to college and studied religion and philosophy, and now she has been able to put this God business behind her, grow up, live her life without recourse to such infantile notions. Well, time will tell who's infantile and who isn't. Perhaps you remember the story of the atheist who fell off the cliff 1,000 feet high and checked his fall only by grabbing the branch of a small tree that grew from the side of the cliff. There he dangles helpless over almost certain death. And of course, even though he's an atheist, he begins to pray, oh God, if you do exist, please save me and I'll never doubt you again. But he is a little bit shocked to hear a voice saying, do you really trust me? To which he stutters, yes, yes, of course. To which the voice responds, then let go of the branch. And in one last gasp of desperation, the atheist calls out, anybody else up there? So there's some measure of helplessness, some sense of our limits as creatures is where it has to begin. And then we have to let go of the branch. That is, we must fall in utter dependency upon a higher. That's how the great theologian of the 19th century, Friedrich Schleiermacher, defined faith. He defined it as a deep inner sense of our ultimate dependency, not on ourselves, but upon our God. We can use a lot of different words to try and describe this inner mood and movement, for that's what it is. We can talk about letting go, we can talk about turning it over, we can talk about resting ourselves in another. When the late Dr. John Paton was a missionary teacher in the New Hebrides, he wanted to translate the Gospel of John into the native tongue, but he found, interestingly enough, that there wasn't a word in that native language for our word to believe, to trust. And how on earth could he translate the Gospel of John without a word for believe? It's a key word, it occurs over 90 times, and so he put the manuscript aside. And then one day he got his word. A native worker who'd been out in the hills working hard came into his office and flopped down in the chair across from him and put his feet up and said a word, which meant, I'm putting my whole weight down. And Dr. Paton said, I've got it. He translated the gospel, and every time he needed a word for believe, he put in that native word, which meant, I'm putting my whole weight down. And it is the absolutely essential and critical move we need to learn to make. Judge Harold Medina, who presided at the trial of 11 communists in 1949 in New York City, told a business group a little later how during the trial he came to the point where he was beaten. His nerves were frayed by telephone calls, by vituperation, by threats against his life and against the lives of members of his family. And he says, one day I felt I had to leave the courtroom, and I'll be frank about it, when I left I knew I was never going back in there. I had stood as much as I could. I had to give up. But suddenly there in my chambers I found myself like a frightened child calling to his father in the dark. I asked God to take charge of things. I asked that his will somehow be done. And I can't report anything mysterious or supernatural. I can only tell you that as I lay on the couch there in the dimness of my chambers, some new kind of strength began to flow in me. That brief period of surrender to my Maker saved not only the trial, but my sanity as well. And it's not only desperation of circumstances that plague and threaten, it is also desperation of soul, if you will, our own personal inadequacies, our moral failures that require this move of trust. Lord, I'm not worthy. Professor of ethics, Louis Schmedes, who teaches in a university out in California, tells of his difficulty in dealing with something that began with his mother. When he was just in 4th grade, the Schmedes family was very poor. His father had died at 31, leaving a wife with no skills, no knowledge of English, and 6 children to feed, and she took in washing and she scrubbed floors. But in her pride, she tried to prevent her children from knowing how she earned the money. But one day, Louis discovered, on his way to school, he saw her on her hands and knees scrubbing a neighbor's porch, and she saw him. "Hello, Louis," was all she said, and then she resumed scrubbing. But Louis says, I was ashamed down to the bottom of my feet, and she knew I was ashamed, and it hurt her deeply. But that shame stuck with me through the years. Not only the shame, but the guilt of feeling ashamed, a vicious circle that plagued my life. And I tried to deny it and excuse it, but it would not go away until finally one day I laid that shadow side of me in the hands of God. He writes, alone, dangling over the edge, falling where nobody could rescue, I fell into my own darkness and discovered that I fell into the hands of a forgiving God. It was all right. In our desperation and unworthiness, we make the move, we let go, we turn in dependence and trust to our God and find that it's all right. Desperation, dependency, and then, if I may, daring, new daring, Lord, speak the word. Here's General Patton talking to a country bumpkin, saying, yes, let's go for it. The thing some fear, that such dependency of heart will breed passivity. It's not so. Faith is our working energy. It is above all else courage. Letting go means getting going. It's precisely when Judge Medina is able to turn to his God in trust that the strength comes to get up off the couch and go back at life. She jumps skyward, arms flung, give me an R, she calls, R, the crowd roars. One of 7 cheerleaders, she's the blonde on the far end, a laughing, smiling University of Hawaii cheerleader, the one doctors said would never walk again. It happened so fast, they were practicing a human pyramid. 2 guys stood side by side, arms length, shoulders straight and level, and up Kathleen Bummel climbed to place a foot on each shoulder, and then another young woman climbed all the wobbly way up to stand on Kathleen's shoulders and cap the pyramid. And 3 times before on that July afternoon of practice, they made the pyramid, no problem. On the 4th try, Kathleen broke her neck. She was 22, former Kentucky State champion track star, in perfect health, but her doctors said to her, you will probably never walk again. At first there was nothing, no feeling, no movement, nothing. I'm a living nothing, she would say to her mother. Then with a little hint of the spirit of this gal, she'd also say, I'm just thankful I can talk because that's what I do best. Her neck was broken at the 6th and 7th vertebra, and the doctors offered her a wheelchair. "What do you mean a wheelchair?" she said. "I'm going to walk out of the hospital." Well, they patted me on the head and said, "Sure, Kathy," and I know they thought I was crazy. I said, "Look, you don't know. I've got God on my side, and we're working on this thing together, and nothing is going to stop us." 2 months later, a muscle twitched in her left thigh. "Hey, I'm there," she said. It was my first step. She never stopped trying. Finally, she had movement in her right leg. It got a little bit more. She never quit. Whenever she could move anything, she says, she moved it. She eventually walked out of the hospital as she had predicted, and the next fall at the homecoming game, before 50,000 cheering football fans, Kathleen Bummel walked alone across the field at halftime, literally a walking miracle. At least that's what some called it. But she and her doctors concurred that the decisive difference was her faith in her God. To the centurion, Jesus said, "Go, let it be done for you according to your faith." Now, does it always happen that way? Perhaps not. But you see, faith never starts with that question. Faith is the courage to go after the best possible future, no matter what. There are a couple of other things we need to note here. It is to Jesus that he comes with his desperation and dependency and daring. Is there something he sees in Jesus that he does not see in Zeus or Apollo? It is important to which God we bring our fears and our failures. The God of frown and judgment, the God of the philosophers, vague and impersonal, the God of our darkest imaginations, or the God that Jesus presents and portrays, a welcoming, caring God who is on our side, who is willing to be with us in our need and despair, wherever, whenever, and whoever we are. Because note, it is to this outsider that saving, healing, faith, and life come. He's a Roman, occupier, despised, alien, foreigner. He does not belong to God's chosen group. He does not go to the right church. He is a pagan. He does not have the right theology. And yet he, the stranger, is the one who finds real faith. Rather like three other strangers, three other foreigners, long years before, outsiders, who also came longing and daring and searching, following a vagrant star, in order also to bow down in faith. Many will come from east and west and will eat with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom. Does make you wonder, doesn't it?